There are parts of the English countryside where the land itself seems to carry a longer memory than the building standing upon it. These are places where the field boundaries have not moved in 5 centuries, where the drainage ditches follow lines first cut by monastic labor, and where the names recorded in the earliest surviving surveys correspond, with only minor distortions of spelling, to the names still used by the farmers who work the same ground today. The valley in question is one such place. It sits in the middle country of England, neither dramatically elevated nor particularly flat, a landscape of moderate gradients and unhurried water, where a shallow river moves through clay soil toward a confluence some miles to the south. It is not a landscape that announces itself. It makes no particular claim on the attention of those passing through it. And yet, examined closely and with patience, it reveals a density of historical layering that is entirely characteristic of the English rural interior. The earliest documentary reference to this particular stretch of land appears not in a legal instrument or a family record, but in an ecclesiastical survey conducted in the mid-13th century. The document, preserved in a cathedral archive and written in the administrative Latin common to such records, lists the plot among the agricultural holdings attached to a small Benedictine dependency in the region. At that time, the land was described in the functional language of medieval land management: its approximate acreage, the quality of its soil for cereal cultivation, its proximity to a water source, and the annual render owed to the mother house. There is no sentiment in the description, no indication that the scribes who produced it considered the land remarkable in any respect. It was productive ground in a productive valley, and it was recorded as such. What is significant about this early reference is not what it says, but what it implies about the continuity of occupation. For land to appear in a formal ecclesiastical survey of this kind, it must already have been under organized cultivation for some considerable time. The clearing of woodland, the management of field drainage, and the establishment of a render system each represent stages of agricultural development that do not occur quickly. By the time the Benedictine surveyors noted the holding in their records, the land had in all probability been worked and managed for generations. The survey does not record beginnings, it records a moment in the middle of a longer story. The topography of the valley exerted a consistent influence on how it was settled and farmed across the medieval period. The river provided both water and a natural boundary, and the gentle rise of the ground to the north and east offered some protection from the prevailing winds without creating the kind of steep gradient that would have made arable cultivation difficult. The soil, a moderately heavy clay over limestone subsoil, was well suited for the mixed farming systems of the medieval Midlands, capable of supporting cereal crops in the upper fields, while the lower, wetter ground near the river was given over to meadow and pasture. This balance of land types made the valley a coherent agricultural unit, and it is reflected in the consistent way the holding is described across a sequence of surveys and rental documents that spanned the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. The nearest settlement of any consequence. By the final decades of the 17th century, the conditions necessary for building had assembled themselves with the quiet inevitability that characterizes the accumulation of gentry wealth in provincial England. The land had passed through several hands since the dissolution, each transfer adding a layer of legal clarity to its ownership and a degree of financial consolidation to its prospects. The family who would commission the manor had arrived at their position through a combination of careful marriage, modest but consistent income from agricultural rents, and the kind of social patience that understood the difference between possessing land and being seen to belong to it. A house of permanent and considered design was not merely a practical necessity. It was a declaration, made in stone and lime and seasoned timber, of a family's intention to remain. The building accounts that survive from the construction period, fragmentary in places but sufficiently detailed in others to support reasonable reconstruction, indicate that work on the principal structure began in the early 1670s and continued in distinct phases over approximately a decade. This was not unusual for a project of this scale and ambition. 17th century building at the gentry level was rarely conceived as a single continuous operation. Materials needed to be sourced, skilled craftsmen engaged for specific elements of the work, and the financial demands of construction balanced against the ongoing obligations of estate management. The accounts record payments to a master mason, a joiner, a plasterer, and at various points a glazier, suggesting that the interior fitments were considered with the same seriousness as the structural fabric. The design of the manor belongs to a recognizable tradition of English provincial architecture that drew, at some distance and through the filter of pattern books and traveled observation, on the classicizing influences that had been moving through the country's building culture since the Restoration. It was not a building of the metropolitan avant-garde. Its designer, likely the master mason himself, working from a combination of practical experience and printed sources, was not seeking novelty. The proportions of the facade are restrained and regular, a central entrance bay slightly projected, flanked by evenly spaced windows of similar dimension, the whole composition rising to a modestly hipped roof with stone coping along the parapet. What the building communicates, first and foremost, is order, and in the context of the late 17th century, order was a deeply considered social statement. The materials used in the construction reflect both the resources of the region and the ambitions of the family commissioning the work. The principal walling material is the local limestone, quarried from an outcrop approximately 3 miles to the northeast and carted to the site along a route that the building accounts describe, in passing, as requiring some improvement before heavy loads could be moved reliably. This stone, a warm pale gray in dry conditions and a deeper, more saturated tone when wet, weathers with considerable consistency and gives the building its characteristic surface quality, neither rough nor polished, but presenting a face to the world of quiet material confidence. The dressings around the windows and door openings are cut from a finer grain stone sourced from further afield, its greater workability allowing the mason to achieve the crisp molded profiles that articulate the facade without ostentation. Internally, the arrangement of rooms follows a logic that is at once practical and symbolic. The entrance hall, positioned on the central axis of the building, is proportioned to receive and impress without overwhelming, a space designed to communicate welcome and authority in approximately equal measure. To either side of this axis, the principal ground floor rooms are disposed in a sequence that reflects the social gradations of late 17th century domestic life: the parlor for family use, the dining room for formal entertainment, the study for the conduct of estate business. Above, the principal bedchambers follow a similar hierarchy, with the best chamber occupying the south-facing position and benefiting from the strongest light in the afternoon hours. The service accommodation is set to the rear and north, separated from the principal rooms by the practical logic of noise, smell, and the invisible but firmly maintained social boundary that organized English domestic space for centuries. The joinery throughout the principal rooms is of oak, its surfaces left largely unadorned beyond the molded profiles of the paneling rails and the turned balusters of the staircase. The staircase itself represents the most ambitious single element of the interior, a broad, rising structure of 3 flights with a carved newel post at its base, its craftsmanship indicating that a specialist joiner was brought from some distance for this commission. The plasterwork of the principal ceilings is modest by metropolitan standards, but carefully executed. Flat fields divided by shallow molded ribs into geometric panels, with a simple cornice carrying an ovalo and cyma profile at the junction with the walls. There is nothing here that could be called fashionable, but there is a great deal that could be called accomplished. The glazing of the windows, recorded in a separate account entry, was supplied in small rectangular panes set in lead cames, the glass itself exhibiting the faint greenish cast and minor surface irregularities characteristic of the period's domestic production. In strong morning light, these windows fill the rooms with a quality of illumination that is particular to buildings of this era, not the flat, even light of later sash glazing, but something more animated, more conscious of the relationship between inside and outside, between the protected interior of the house and the working landscape it was built to overlook and govern. When the building was substantially complete, sometime in the early 1680s, it stood as a coherent and considered expression of its owner's place in the world. It was not a great house. It made no claim to compete with the seat of a peer or the ambitions of a newly enriched city merchant. What it represented, with some precision, was the upper tier of provincial gentry confidence, a family that had consolidated its position sufficiently to build in stone, to employ skilled craftsmen, and to arrange its domestic life according to the spatial grammar of polite society. The manor did not announce its presence in the valley. It simply occupied it with the settled authority of something that had been carefully planned and patiently executed. Expanding. Chapter 3. The Household in its Prime. In the first decades of the 18th century, the manor settled into the rhythms of a fully functioning gentry household with the kind of quiet assurance that only comes from an established domestic order. The building was no longer new. Its limestone facade had begun to acquire the first traces of weathering that would deepen over subsequent generations, and the oak joinery of the principal rooms had darkened to the particular warm brown that comes not from age alone, but from the accumulated effect of firelight, candle smoke, and the oils applied regularly by household staff. The house had been lived in long enough to bear the marks of occupation, and those marks were, in the early 18th century, the marks of prosperity. The household inventory taken in the second decade of the century, a document preserved in its entirety among the family's surviving papers, provides the most detailed single picture of the interior at this period. Room by room, it records the contents of the house in the methodical language of probate administration. The number and condition of window curtains, the quality of bed furniture in each chamber, the contents of the linen press, the silver on the dining room sideboard, the books in the study. Read as a whole, it describes a household that had furnished itself carefully and consistently over a generation, acquiring the material vocabulary of polite domestic life without apparent extravagance. The silver is noted as substantial. The library, while not large, contains works of theology, history, and agricultural improvement that reflect the reading habits of a man engaged with both the spiritual and practical dimensions of his position. The beds in the principal chambers are hung with wool damask, those in the lesser rooms with plain serge. Each distinction is noted with the same dispassionate precision. The family at the center of this household was, in the early 18th century, a compact domestic unit by the standards of the period. The head of the household, a man then in his late 40s, having inherited the property from his father who had commissioned the building, was a figure of moderate regional prominence. His name appears in the commission of the peace for the county from 1708, indicating a degree of administrative standing that placed him among the active magistracy of the area without elevating him to its highest tier. He served on at least 2 grand juries in the period before 1715, and his correspondence with neighboring landowners on matters of drainage, enclosure, and road maintenance reflects a man attentive to the practical governance of the landscape around him. He was, in the language his contemporaries would have recognized, a useful man, neither brilliant nor negligible, but dependable and present. His wife's role within the household is recorded less directly in the formal documentary sources, but is traceable through a different order of evidence. The household accounts that survive from the 1710s and early 1720s, kept in a hand distinct from the estate accounts, and almost certainly hers, record the weekly expenditure for provisions with a consistency and detail that speak to a domestic management conducted with considerable competence. The purchases of spices, preserved fruit, candles, soap, and linen thread follow seasonal patterns that reflect both the agricultural calendar and the social obligations of a household that received guests regularly. The accounts for the winter quarter of 1714 record provisions for a dinner of at least 14 covers, a gathering that, in the context of a provincial gentry household, represents a significant occasion managed entirely within the domestic sphere. The staff employed at the manor during this period numbered, by reasonable estimate from the wage entries in the accounts, somewhere between 8 and 12 indoor servants, with a further complement of outdoor workers, gardeners, grooms, and farm laborers whose employment was recorded separately as part of the estate rather than the household accounts. Indoors, a hierarchy of function and status operated with the precision characteristic of early 18th century domestic service. A housekeeper appears consistently in the wage records across nearly 2 decades, her annual payment notably higher than the other indoor staff, and her continuity of employment suggested both competence and the particular trust that a position of her responsibility required. Below her, housemaids, a cook, a kitchen maid, and various footmen and manservants moved through the daily operations of the house according to routines that left no dramatic record, but whose cumulative effect was the maintenance of a comfortable and orderly domestic environment. The estate surrounding the manor was managed during this period with the attentiveness that characterized improving landlordship at the turn of the century. The rental income from the surrounding farms formed the principal financial basis of the household, and the estate correspondence of the period shows a proprietor who knew his tenants' names, understood the particular challenges of each holding, and adjusted his expectations of payment in response to the agricultural difficulties that periodically affected the region. There is nothing sentimental in this correspondence. The tone is businesslike throughout, but it reflects a working relationship between landlord and tenant built on mutual familiarity rather than distance. The social life of the household extended beyond its immediate walls in the manner typical of provincial gentry existence at this period. Visits to and from neighboring families are documented both in correspondence and account books, and the manor appears to have participated in the circuit of dinners, seasonal gatherings, and occasional balls that constituted the social fabric of county society. The family's connections, while not extending to the highest levels of national political life, were sufficient to maintain their position within the middle tier of county relationships. The marriages of their children in the following generation would extend those connections in the manner that gentry families had always understood as the primary instrument of social consolidation. What the early 18th century represents in the history of the manor is a period of achieved stability. The building had been raised, the household had been organized, the estate had been managed, and the family had established itself as a fixture in the social and administrative life of the county. There was nothing exceptional about all of this, and in that absence of exception lay precisely its significance, a household functioning as it had been designed to function, occupying its place in the world with the undemonstrative confidence of a family that had, for the moment, arrived.
There is a particular quality to the absence of evidence that experienced archivists learn to recognize with time. It is distinct from the ordinary incompleteness that characterizes most historical records, the routine losses of fire, flood, neglect, and the simple passage of years that account for the gaps in almost every archive touching the provincial English gentry. Those losses have a character of their own. They are uneven, unpredictable, and distributed without apparent logic across the surviving material. What presents itself in the documentary record of this manor midway through the 18th century is something of a different order. The silences here are concentrated. They gather around a specific period with a consistency that draws the attention of anyone working through the material in sequence, and they persist across several distinct categories of records simultaneously. The estate accounts, which had been maintained with reasonable regularity since the early years of the century, become sparse in the 1740s and remain so for the better part of a decade. This is not simply a matter of missing volumes, though at least one account book from this period appears never to have been located in any known collection. The volumes that do survive from these years contain entries that are notably thinner than those of the preceding decades, with longer intervals between entries and a reduced specificity of detail that suggests either a disruption in the household's administrative routine or a reduced engagement with the formal recording of its financial affairs. Expenditure on household provisions, which had previously been tracked on a weekly basis, appears in some surviving folios only at quarterly intervals and without the subcategories that had made the earlier accounts so informative. The record does not cease entirely, it simply contracts, as if the household's attention had been drawn elsewhere, or as if the energy available for domestic administration had, for a period, been diminished. The correspondence archive presents a related pattern. Letters received by the family from county neighbours, legal advisors, and estate agents, which survive in reasonable numbers through the 1730s, become markedly fewer after approximately 1743. More significantly, the outgoing correspondence, traceable in part through the letterbooks maintained in earlier decades and through copies preserved in the archives of correspondence, shows a similar reduction. Families who had exchanged letters with the manor's proprietors on a seasonal basis appear in their own archives to have received no reply to communications sent during this period. In one instance, a letter from a neighbouring landowner regarding a boundary matter of evident practical importance sits in a county archive with a note in a later hand indicating that no response was received and that the matter was eventually resolved without reference to the manor. The absence of reply is noted but not explained. The parish registers of the village church, which had recorded the family's baptisms, marriages, and burials with the regularity appropriate to their position, reflect a similar withdrawal. Between the mid-1440s and the early 1450s, the family's name appears in the registers with considerably reduced frequency. There are no baptisms recorded during this period, which may indicate simply a stage in the family's demographic cycle rather than any deliberate absence. There is, however, a burial entry from 1747 that has attracted the attention of local historians. A member of the household recorded with an unusual brevity of description in the register, without the customary elaboration of status and family connection that the family's position would normally have warranted. The entry itself is unremarkable in its physical appearance, the same ink, the same hand as the surrounding entries, but its comparative thinness has been noted. County administrative records from the same period offer a further dimension to the picture. The family's name, which had appeared regularly in the Commission of the Peace documentation and in the records of quarter sessions through the first 4 decades of the century, becomes absent from these sources during the years in question. Whether this reflects a formal removal from the magistracy, a voluntary withdrawal from public duties, or simply a period of incapacity, the records do not clarify. The discontinuity is present and consistent without being explained by any accompanying documentation. It would be methodologically unsound to interpret this confluence of absences as evidence of a single cause. Historians working with the material have been appropriately cautious. The mid-18th century was a period of considerable agricultural pressure in the English Midlands, and the financial difficulties that affected many middling gentry estates during the 1740s offer one plausible framework for understanding a reduction in administrative activity. Illness within a household could produce similar patterns across multiple record types simultaneously. The death of a particularly active family member, on whose habits and energy the maintenance of correspondence and accounts had depended, might account for the contraction observed in several distinct categories of evidence. None of these explanations is ruled out by what survives. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the manor continued to be occupied during this period. A rate assessment from the mid-1440s includes the property among the taxable holdings of the parish, and a brief reference in a land agent's memorandum from approximately 1449 indicates that the estate's farms were still under active tenancy. The building itself was not abandoned, the land was not sold, and the family's legal connection to the property remained intact throughout. Whatever the nature of the difficulties, and the evidence does not permit their precise characterization, they did not result in the kind of rupture that would have generated the legal and administrative paperwork that accompanies property transactions or formal insolvency. By the early 1450s, the record begins gradually to recover something of its earlier density. A new sequence of estate accounts opens in 1752, maintained in a different hand from those of the preceding decades, suggesting new personnel within the household administration, if not new ownership. Correspondence resumes, initially tentative in volume, and the family's name reappears in parish and county records with growing regularity as the decade advances. The contraction, whatever its cause, was not permanent. The household that emerges from the thin years of the mid-century is recognizably the same institution that had existed before them, diminished perhaps in some respects that the surviving evidence does not fully illuminate, but present, functioning, and once again engaged with the administrative life of the estate and the county around it.
Expanding Chapter 5: Inheritance and Reluctance. The transfer of a gentry estate from one generation to the next was, in 18th century England, rarely a simple transaction. It was a process shaped by the terms of the original settlement, the debts accumulated against the property during the preceding generation, the number and expectations of surviving family members with claims upon the estate, and the particular temperament of those who found themselves in possession of land they had not built or chosen, but had simply inherited. When the manor passed to the second generation of the family, sometime in the late 1750s following the death of the previous head of household, all of these considerations were present in some degree, and the documentary record of the transfer reflects the careful, somewhat laborious process by which a property of this kind changed hands within the structures of English property law. The probate and conveyancing documents that survive from this period are detailed enough to establish the essential terms of the inheritance. The estate passed under the provisions of an entail established in the original family settlement, meaning that its principal components, the manor house, the home farm, and the majority of the tenanted agricultural land, transferred intact to the eldest surviving male heir without the possibility of subdivision or sale of the principal holding. The legal correspondence surrounding this transfer, preserved among solicitors' papers in a county archive, suggests that the process was not without its complications. A younger sibling's claims on certain personal property required negotiation, and the settlement of outstanding debts against the estate occupied the family's legal advisors for the better part of a year before the new proprietor could be said to hold the property in an entirely unencumbered condition. What is notable about the second generation's relationship with the manor is not any single recorded act or decision, but rather a pattern that emerges gradually and with some consistency across several distinct categories of surviving evidence. The new proprietor had, prior to his inheritance, established himself in a life that was organized around commitments elsewhere. A diary kept intermittently during the 1760s and preserved among a related family's papers records visits to the manor in terms that suggest the visits were events rather than returns, occasions planned and noted rather than the unremarkable oscillations of a man moving between the rooms of his own house. The diary's author refers to the property with a formality of reference that is slightly at odds with the intimacy that familiarity would typically produce. The manor is described by its name rather than simply as home, and the periods of residence noted are measured in weeks rather than the continuous seasonal occupation that had characterized his parents' generation. The legal correspondence of the same period reinforces this impression without clarifying its cause. Letters exchanged between the new proprietor and his estate agent regarding the management of the tenanted farms show a man exercising his landlord's responsibilities conscientiously but at a distance, issuing instructions through the agent rather than conducting the face-to-face dealings with tenants that his father's correspondence had reflected. The agent's replies, several of which have survived in the same collection, occasionally include passing references to the condition of the manor house itself, references to maintenance questions requiring the proprietor's attention, to decisions about the kitchen garden's management, and on one occasion to a question regarding the use of certain ground floor rooms that the agent appears to have been uncertain how to address in the proprietor's absence. These are minor administrative details, and they are treated as such in the correspondence. Taken together, however, they describe a property whose day-to-day management was increasingly delegated and whose principal rooms were not in regular use. The reasons offered across the various sources for this reduced pattern of occupation are neither consistent nor complete. The diary references suggest, in places, that the new proprietor found the management of his wider affairs, which included interests and obligations beyond the immediate county, more comfortably conducted from elsewhere.
A letter from the early 1770s, written to a family connection in a town some distance away, mentions the manor in a passage concerned with the difficulty of maintaining a large house without the household staff that regular occupation would justify. The phrasing is practical rather than personal. The letter is written by a man calculating the logistics of a property he regards as a responsibility rather than a preference. There is nothing in this that is historically unusual. Many gentry families of the period maintained country houses in precisely this condition, visiting seasonally while their principal domestic life was organized around more convenient establishments. The pattern itself is unremarkable. What gives it particular significance in this context is the consistency with which, across the second generation, the manor appears as a place visited rather than inhabited. By the final decades of the 18th century, the estate's farms continued to generate the rental income upon which the family's financial position depended, and the property was maintained in a condition that prevented serious deterioration. But the quality of domestic occupation that had characterized the early 18th century, the fully staffed household, the regular social engagements, and the continuous administrative engagement with the surrounding community had given way to something more intermittent. The manor was not neglected, it was simply less present in the lives of those who owned it than it had been previously, and not distance accumulating quietly across a generation of reduced residents left its mark not in any dramatic alteration to the fabric of the building, but in the gradual thinning of the human activity recorded within it. The house stood as it had always stood, its limestone facade unchanged, its proportions unaltered, but the life organized within those proportions had contracted, and the contraction, unremarked upon in any single document, is legible across the archive as a whole.
When an inherited practice has persisted long enough to require no explanation among those who observe it, it has crossed a particular threshold in the life of a household. It has ceased to be a response to circumstances and become, simply, the way things are done. By the time the estate passed to the third generation of the family in the mid-19th century, certain habits surrounding the use and non-use of the manor's interior spaces appear to have reached precisely this condition. They are not announced in the surviving correspondence as novelties or departures from previous custom. They appear, where they appear at all, as established facts, mentioned in passing, assumed as context, requiring no justification in the letters and instructions in which they surface. It is this quality of unremarked familiarity, more than any single reference, that gives the documentary evidence of this period its particular character. The mid-19th century was a period of considerable change in the material culture and domestic expectations of the English gentry. The preceding decades had seen significant improvements in the comfort and convenience of country houses at every level of the social scale. Improved heating systems, remodeled service arrangements, updated furnishings in the lighter and more elaborate styles favored by the Victorian period's decorative sensibility. At many properties comparable to scale to the manor, this era saw programs of renovation and modernization that left the interiors substantially altered from their 17th century condition. At this manor, the evidence suggests a different trajectory. The third generation inherited a building that had been maintained but not updated, and the correspondence of the period reflects an approach to the property that prioritized the management of its estate income over any investment in the improvement or modernization of the house itself. The preference for the dower house over the principal building as the family's primary residence appears in the documentary record with a matter-of-factness that implies it had been established practice for some time before the period in question. The dower house, a smaller, more recent structure, set at a comfortable distance from the manor on the northern portion of the home farm, had been built in the later 18th century as accommodation for widowed family members, and was, by the mid-19th century, a well-maintained and comfortable dwelling of modest proportions. Several letters from the 1850s and 1860s, written by the third generation's principal family member to relatives and legal correspondents, give the dower house as the return address without comment or explanation. The manor is referred to in these letters as a distinct and separate entity, a property to be managed, inspected, and maintained, rather than a home in any continuous sense. The references to rooms within the principal building that were no longer in regular use emerge from this same body of correspondence with similar quietness. In one letter from the early 1960s, the writer mentions arrangements made for a visiting relative's accommodation and specifies in a subordinate clause that treats the matter as entirely routine that the north wing's ground floor rooms are not being opened for the visit and that the guest will be comfortable in the upper south-facing chambers instead. No reason is given for the exclusion of the north wing rooms. The letter moves immediately to other matters. In another letter from approximately the same period, a reference to the state of the principal staircase includes a passing remark that it has not been used with any regularity since the family's occupation shifted to the upper south rooms and the garden entrance. Again, the observation is made without explanation, as if the writer expects the recipient to understand the context already. The most precise surviving reference to the management of the building's interior spaces comes not from personal correspondence, but from a set of written instructions left by the third generation's head of household for the land agent who oversaw the property during periods of the family's absence. These instructions, preserved among the agent's papers and written in a clear, businesslike hand, cover a range of practical matters: the maintenance of the tenanted farms, the upkeep of the kitchen garden, the management of the home farm's seasonal labor. Among these practical directives, one passage stands out for its specificity. The agent is instructed that certain areas of the principal building are to be secured, the word used is locked, after dark during periods when the family is not in residence, and that keys to these areas to remain with the agent rather than being left accessible to the household staff. The areas are identified by their position within the building, the north-facing ground floor rooms and the lower section of the original service corridor, rather than by any descriptive or explanatory term. The instruction is given with the same tone as the others: practical, clear, and entirely unexplained. Historians examining this document have noted the instruction without finding a definitive interpretive framework. Practical explanations are not difficult to construct. The securing of unused rooms in a partially occupied country house was a reasonable precaution for theft and deterioration. The delegation of key-holding to a trusted agent was standard estate management practice. The specific identification of north-facing ground floor rooms as requiring this attention might reflect nothing more than their particular vulnerability to damp, their distance from the occupied portions of the house, or their contents, items of value left in storage during the family's reduced occupation. None of these explanations is contradicted by the available evidence. What the documentary record of the third generation offers, taken as a whole, is a picture of inherited custom, a set of domestic arrangements that had solidified over the course of 2 or 3 generations of reduced and selective occupation into the unremarkable routines of a household that had learned to inhabit its property partially. The manor was not feared or avoided in any dramatic sense that the evidence supports. It was simply used selectively, its more remote and less accessible areas maintained in a condition of managed closure that had become, by the mid-19th century, the ordinary state of affairs. The building accommodated this partial occupation as it had accommodated everything else, quietly, without complaint, its limestone exterior unchanged and its interior proportions unaltered, holding within its closed rooms whatever combination of cold, damp, and accumulated domestic history had made their regular use for this generation, as for the one before it, a matter of little apparent interest.
The pressures that brought the manor's long period of family ownership to its eventual close were not peculiar to this estate or this family. They were the pressures of an era, a broad structural transformation in the economic and social conditions that had sustained the English landed gentry for 2 centuries, arriving in the late 19th century with the quiet force of processes that had been building for decades before their consequences became impossible to manage.
The agricultural depression that settled across much of England from the late 1870s onward struck with particular severity at estates whose income depended primarily on arable farming rents. When grain prices fell in response to the arrival of cheaper imported wheat from North America and the newly opened lands of the Southern Hemisphere, the rental income that had formed the financial foundation of households like this one contracted with a speed that estate management structures built for stability were not designed to absorb. The family's correspondence from the 1880s and 1990s reflects this pressure with an increasing candor that earlier generations writing in more comfortable circumstances had not needed to employ. Letters exchanged with the family's solicitors during this period move through a familiar sequence of concerns: the reduction of certain farm rents to retain tenants who might otherwise have abandoned their holdings entirely, the deferral of maintenance expenditure on the principal building, the investigation of whether certain outlying portions of the estate might be sold without triggering the entail provisions that protected the core holding. These were not the letters of a family in crisis, but they were the letters of a family making the careful, unglamorous calculations that declining income imposes on those accustomed to a different standard of management. The introduction of death duties under the Finance Act of 1894 added a further and more immediate pressure to the estate's already strained finances. When a significant death occurred within the family in the final years of the 19th century, the resulting duty assessment against the estate's rateable value required a financial response that the reduced income of the preceding decade had left the family poorly positioned to meet. The solicitor's letters from this period document the process of that response with the methodical precision of professionals managing a situation that, while personally difficult for their clients, was administratively familiar from many similar instructions received from similar estates across the same years. The auction of the manor's contents, conducted over 2 days in the early years of the 20th century, was recorded in a catalog that survives in reasonable condition among a local collection. Its pages list the rooms of the house in sequence, describing in the language of the auction trade the furniture, textiles, silver, ceramics, and miscellaneous household objects accumulated across more than 2 centuries of occupation. The descriptions are functional and without sentiment, dimensions given for the larger pieces, condition noted where relevant, estimates absent in the manner of the period's practice. Read today, the catalog performs an inadvertent service as a domestic inventory, recording in its commercial language the final disposition of objects whose earlier appearances in the household inventories of the 18th century had marked the estate's prosperity. The wing chairs in wool damask, the gate leg tables, the silver plate noted as substantial in the accounts of the 1710s, their descendants or successors pass through the catalog and out of the family's possession without ceremony. The farmland was disposed of in a separate sequence of transactions extending across the first decade of the 20th century. Several of the larger tenant farms were sold to their occupying tenants under the provisions that the period's land legislation had made increasingly practical, a process that reduced the estate's acreage substantially while releasing capital that was applied, in part, to the maintenance of the principal building in a reduced but structurally sound condition. The leasing of the remaining farmlands to a neighboring agricultural operator provided a modest continuing income sufficient to cover the costs of the building's basic upkeep, but not its habitation at any scale resembling its earlier domestic use. The departure of the last resident family member from the manor is recorded in the local newspaper of the nearest market town in a brief item from the years immediately preceding the First World War. The item is characteristic of its genre, respectful in tone, modest in detail, noting the family's long association with the property and the parish without dwelling on the financial circumstances that had produced the departure. The manor itself, the item notes, is to remain in the family's ownership while its future use is determined, a formulation that the passage of time would reveal as the beginning of a long and unresolved question, rather than a temporary pause before resumption. What the late 19th and early 20th centuries represent in the history of this estate is not the story of a single family's failure, but the working out of forces that were reshaping the English countryside with systematic thoroughness across this entire period. Hundreds of houses comparable in scale and character to the manor passed through similar sequences of reduced occupation, content dispersal, and eventual departure during these decades, their histories unfolding in parallel across county after county with the impersonal consistency of an economic tide. The manor's experience was individual in its details and typical in its structure, a combination that places it precisely and without distortion within one of the defining social processes of its age. The manor stands today in a condition that resists easy categorization. It is neither ruin nor restoration, neither abandoned shell nor maintained residence. It occupies the intermediate state that many English country houses of its age and scale have reached through the accumulated effect of decades of minimal intervention. Structurally sound in its principal elements, compromised in its secondary ones, its fabric telling a story of managed survival rather than either neglect or renewal. The limestone of the exterior walls has weathered to the deep, complex gray of stone that has faced 2.5 centuries of English climate, its surface now carrying the full record of its exposure. Darker courses where water has run consistently from the parapet, paler stretches protected by the slate overhang of the coping stones, patches of lichen in the shaded areas that have not changed their boundaries within living memory. The building's proportions remain exactly as the master mason established them in the 1670s. The facade is unchanged in its essential geometry, and it is this continuity of form, more than any other quality, that makes the building legible as a historical document to those who approach it with attention. The interior presents a more complex picture. The principal rooms of the south-facing range retain their 17th century paneling, though its condition varies between rooms, sound and intact in some, affected by moisture penetration in others. The oak surface in the worst areas showing the gray, slightly softened quality of wood that has endured repeated cycles of damp and partial drying over many years. The staircase survives complete, its carved newel post and turned balusters intact, the broad oak treads worn in a pattern that records the preferred path of ascent across all the generations that used them. The plasterwork of the principal ceilings is partially surviving, one ceiling complete and still exhibiting its original geometric panel divisions with reasonable clarity, another reduced by collapse to a section covering perhaps 2/3 of the room, the exposed lath above the gap showing the construction method of the original work with a directness that no intact surface could provide. The north-facing ground floor rooms, those identified in the 19th century agent's instructions as requiring special management, are in the poorest condition of the principal spaces, their floors affected by rising damp, their paneling largely lost, their window openings blocked at some point in the 20th century with plain brick infill that belongs to no architectural tradition the building recognizes. The building's place in local historical memory is of the kind that accumulates around properties with long associations and incomplete records. It is known to the village and the surrounding parish in the way that old buildings become known, through the layered sediment of observation, family recollection, and the particular quality of attention that a building of obvious age and uncertain recent history tends to attract from those who pass it regularly. Local accounts collected in the 20th century by a county historical society contain references to the property that reflect several generations of community awareness, practical observations about its condition, recollections of the last family members and residents, and a small number of accounts that touch, with varying degrees of specificity, on the domestic customs that the 19th century correspondence had begun to document. These oral records have the character of all such material. They are interesting as evidence of how a community has processed and transmitted its awareness of a place, and they require the same careful handling as any other source whose relationship to verifiable fact is indirect. What the preceding chapters of this account have established through the patient examination of the documentary record is a history of considerable clarity in some periods and genuine uncertainty in others. The building's construction, its early occupation, its administrative life across the 18th century, and the economic processes that ended its continuous family habitation in the early 20th century are all recoverable in their essential character from the surviving evidence. The period of reduced record in the mid-18th century remains without definitive explanation. The precise reasons for the patterns of